I'm Tom, and I'm a BBC journalist who also happens to be British and Jewish. I'm proud of who I am, but the past year has been complicated and sometimes frightening.
Respect that. It's Jewish.
In the first 6 months of 2021, there was a record spike in anti-Semitism. From controversy around the Middle East to conspiracy theories and the toxic environment of social media, many Jewish people are questioning how safe it is to express who they are. I want to find out what's going on, and I'm starting in Burnley, where Ashley was the victim of an extreme example of anti-Semitism. In March 2020, Ashley was attacked by 3 men just outside his home. The assault took place in front of his mum.
They were going by that blue car is now, but it was a different colour car then, and started shouting, "Dirty Jew, look at that dirty Jew." And then one of them came under the driveway then and started attacking me. And I was full of blood, and I was still with the adrenaline pumping.
And I mean, how long were you dealing with the physical injuries and...
About 3-4 weeks.
And any mental injuries off the back of it?
PTSD. It took me a while to go back outside again. Quite a lot of people in Burnley actually came to me and said, "Are you okay? Do you need anything?" Stuff like that. It was really heartwarming.
What does your Jewish identity mean to you?
Everything. Absolutely everything. It's my life, really.
And how does it make you feel that something you hold clearly so dear to you, something you love about yourself, is something that other people use as a target?
It hurts me a lot, because end of the day, what we all want is just to live our lives in peace. Never going to happen though.
So have things got worse for Jews in this country? To find out, I'm meeting up with Dave Rich, head of policy at a Jewish charity called the Community Security Trust. The CST gathers reports from members of the public and shares data with several police forces around the UK, keeping a record of how many anti-Semitic incidents take place each year. Recently, there's been a lot about anti-Semitic hate crime in the news. What is the latest report that you've produced?
Sadly, during the recent conflict in Israel and Gaza in May this year, we recorded over 600 anti-Semitic incidents in a 1-month period, which is more than we've ever seen in a single month period since CST has been doing this work, which is since 1984. One of the things that was really different and quite worrying this time around was the number of anti-Semitic incidents reported to us from schools and from universities. Around 1 in 4 of all the incidents we recorded during that month of the conflict happened in an educational setting. The impact on the young people who experience that anti-Semitism is awful.
I also wanted to ask Dave if he could define when legitimate criticism of the Israeli government lapses into outright anti-Semitism.
So if someone walks down Oxford Street waving a Palestinian flag and shouting "Free Palestine," we would never consider that anti-Semitic. It's obviously not. But if someone walks past a synagogue or walks through a heavily Jewish neighbourhood shouting "Free Palestine" at the Jewish people on the street in order to harass them and upset them, it takes on a completely different meaning, and that's when you're seeing Jewish people being targeted.
Anti-Semitism at schools and unis is complicated, and it's often tied to strong views about one tiny but hugely contentious place: Israel. At Bristol University, a professor allegedly made comments about Israel which Jewish students say made them feel targeted. I'm meeting a student who tackled the situation head on. Broadly then, what were the controversial comments that he was making? What was it all about?
Yeah, so the key stuff was definitely the Jewish society is pawn to the Israeli state, because it was implying that sort of a bunch of students, like under 18-year-olds at Bristol, were manufacturing complaints of anti-Semitism to get rid of him.
So what effect did his statements have on Jewish students at the university?
A lot of students are very concerned about being in his class. I think it also just created a generally quite hostile environment at Bristol Uni. So when I started the petition, I got an email from the Electronic Intifada, who are a news blog, and they wrote an article about me, examples of the comments I received. I was told to go die, Zionist scum, dirty Zio. I've never received just the sheer volume of comments and anti-Semitism before. So it just did feel quite overwhelming just to have that number of people know who I was, possibly know where I go to uni, possibly know where I live.
David Miller denies he was anti-Semitic. Nonetheless, in October, after a 2-year investigation, he was sacked by Bristol University. David Miller's appealing against his dismissal, and I reached out to him for a response to the allegations, but didn't receive a reply. the situation highlights just how complicated conversations around Israel can be. And that's true even among Jewish families. I didn't grow up in a particularly religious home, but my parents have always made me feel proud about being Jewish. I invited them over for lunch to hear their points of view. Hello, Mum. Come in.
Hello.
Hello. Come in. I'll go and have you. Hello. You might recognise these mums. I've had times when you've called me and told me that you feel frightened. What is it specifically you feel frightened of?
You can't help but get distressed when people's views about a political situation bleed into the way they treat people in this country who are in no way responsible for that situation and whose views about that situation you can't possibly know. When you're Jewish and you begin to see that sort of prejudice, you think, well, we know what this is about. We've been here many, many times before.
Do you feel frightened?
I don't feel personally threatened. I think this is a very balanced society, and I think the majority of people would not buy into those kind of views. I wouldn't equate it with the sort of anti-Semitism that existed, in the 19th century in Russia, or in the 1930s in Germany. I just don't think that the British society could actually go there, because the majority of people here are not anti-Semitic. So I don't feel personally under threat.
It's kind of interesting that Mum feels it more keenly, but you feel it less keenly when you're the one whose personal family history, bears more scars of what happened in the 20th century. More of your family, bluntly, were killed.
Yeah, I've never met any of my grandparents. They all died in concentration camps. I had an uncle and a cousin that died in concentration camps that I never knew. But I come from a family where we put it behind us.
How fundamental is your Jewishness to who you are?
In my public life, I think of myself as British. In my private life, I'm Jewish, I'm very strongly Jewish, and I think a lot of my ethics are very Jewish. Instinctively, I think Jewish people, as a minority, identify with other minorities. I think that will be one of the terrible things that might be the outcome of the rise in anti-Semitism, that we might become more inward-looking, whereas I think it's part of our ethics to identify with other people and do whatever we can to support them.
Their difference of opinion actually demonstrates an important point. Jews aren't some monolithic group who think or feel or even look the same way. I'm meeting Nadine, who's a black Jewish woman. I first heard about her last year when she called out anti-Semitism on Twitter.
It just demonstrated the complexities of what it can be like being a Jewish black person. It's a lot easier to recognise if someone calls me the N-word or someone says something derogatory about my skin colour, to know that it's racist, versus, if someone makes a comment like, Jews run the media. It's not as overt, but I also think they manifest themselves differently. I think, in the 21st century, you don't have the kind of structural, socio-economic, intergenerational inequality that you see within black communities, as in the same in the Jewish community, but that doesn't mean that, the threat levels aren't serious. I just don't think people have a very solid understanding of what anti-Semitism is, because I just don't think we're taught about it very well.
So we're on the way to meet a young lady who works as a nurse in an East London hospital, and back in May, during the flare-up of the conflict, she had a fairly unpleasant experience while she was at work, and I think what happened to her is quite a good demonstration of how complicated things can be when Israel is in the news, and how that affects Jewish people living even in the UK.
Hello, how are you? I was downstairs in the prayer room praying the afternoon service, and then made my way back upstairs to the 8th floor. Two guys were in the lift, and I just see them look at me, and one of them turns to me and said, "So do you not believe in free Palestine? How can they let someone who comes from people who kill innocent children work here?" And I'm happy that he stumbled and fumbled, because by the time he said that to me, the doors opened and I managed to get out. It all happened very quickly. Obviously, it's petrifying. I don't think that whatever's going on in the world in terms of the fighting and the, do you believe in this side, do you believe in that side, that shouldn't affect anyone's medical care that's happening. And I would never use someone's beliefs or religion or ethnicity or anything to decide how I'm going to treat them.
Many Jews do feel an affinity with Israel, but for some, it's more complicated. Francesca is part of a group of British Jewish activists who campaign against the actions of the Israeli government.
Yes, we do get a lot of backlash from more right-wing sort of people and organisations. Our feeling is that if we're ruffling feathers, it kind of means that we are putting out a good and kind of challenging message that makes people think.
Have you had any anti-Semitism come at you because of Israel?
Yeah, I think often people who speak out against the occupation are seen as the good Jew and are kind of posed as, it's like people want to grill you to understand if you're anti-occupation before kind of feeling like they can accept you as a Jewish person, in left-wing circles specifically. But also we do have a responsibility as Jewish people to speak up against atrocities in the world. Doesn't mean that we should be held responsible for it as diaspora Jews, but I think speaking out against it is important.
Francesca spoke about being held to account over what happens in Israel in a way that she found problematic. I want to speak directly to someone whose activism leads to accusations of anti-Semitism, so I'm meeting up with two YouTubers. Back in May, they drove to a Jewish community in London and filmed themselves challenging Jewish people on the street. One of their videos, titled "Muslims Confront Radical Israelis," all in caps, has racked up almost 300,000 views.
According to the definition of the British government, which on anti-Semitism, which was published in 2016, one of the definitions of anti-Semitism is when you hold Jewish people responsible for the actions of the Israeli government. And I think doing that conflation puts at risk people being anti-Semitic. And so it's very important that if someone is an apologist for Israel or for Zionism, that should be outlined and delineated, or otherwise completely separated from Jewishness.
Isn't the title of your video, "Muslims Confront Radical Israelis"?
Yes.
And isn't that doing exactly what you're saying shouldn't be done? Conflating a group of Jewish people in Britain and calling them Israelis.
I mean, if someone identifies as an Israeli supporter, an apologist, or a pro-Zionist, right, then they have already shown their cards. What we're saying is that there is a difference between Israeli discourse or pro-Israeli discourse. When we say that, we mean those who are sympathetic or apologetic to the policies of the Israeli government, the policies of blockade, the policies of settlement. If we decide to oppose these policies, okay, that should never be conflated with anti-Jewishness.
But I think specifically that video did strike me as problematic in lots of ways. And I think specifically the title of the video, "Muslims Confront Radical Israelis," do you not see how that is problematic in itself?
There are radical Israelis.
And do you think there's a different way of communicating?
What I mean is, you're objecting to the term radical Israeli. Are there such things as radical Iranians? Are there such things as radical Koreans?
No, but I'm objecting to radical Israelis because you went to speak to just some, fairly religious Jewish people who are British people. They are certainly, you definitely don't know if they're Israelis.
No. They identified as such. And not only that...
I didn't see a single person in that video identify themselves as an Israeli.
There was more than one video.
So I definitely think that helping people understand one another better is an important part of dealing with prejudice. But like Nadine said, anti-Semitism is something a lot of people don't really understand. Sometimes anti-Semitism is really easy to recognise. It's those mad conspiracy theories about world domination, or it's someone being beaten up simply for who they are. When we're in a situation where discrimination is normalised and people who say they feel unsafe aren't being listened to, well, that's something I don't think any of us should be willing to accept.